wanted to do today is talk to you about ways to erase the stigma of mental illness. By the way, you're most welcome to take pictures as you go. We're also going to make the slides available to you. You'll also see our website. All of this can be downloaded on the website. Everything we got here can be obtained for free. I've become very interested in understanding how to fix stigma. I really don't think you need to understand what it is, and we all know what stigma is. And it led to us developing this program called Honest, Open, Proud, which we've worked with Chris White in terms of rolling out in Scotland next week. And so what I wanted to do was put it in perspective for you how it addresses stigma. I don't think we need to work very hard to know what stigma is. It's a disrespectful image of people, in our case here, of people with mental illness. There's very many stereotypes of mental illness. Of course, the big one is the idea that we're dangerous. I don't think we need to really understand what the goal is. The goal is to stop it. As Peter suggested, some people ran into the world really fast trying to stop it and actually probably made some errors or actually made stigma worse. And so what I'm interested in discussing with you and sharing with you is how to fix it. Let me say now, because it's morning and you might drift in and out, I'll give you that key moment when I'm saying something really important so you can sort of doze off for the boring stuff. The really important thing is the only way you change stigma is people with lived experience lead the charge, and they come out and talk about their story proudly and with honor. And so that's what the goal of Honest, Open, Proud is. And so what I want to do with you today is very briefly come with a common understanding of what stigma is, and then some critical appraisal of what works and what does not, leading to Honest, Open, Proud. Honest, Open, Proud's been around about 4 or 5 years, developed by people with lived experience. We've actually been doing it enough that we have some problems that we're wondering about that we'd love to get your feedback in terms of rolling it out worldwide. When I talk about trying to understand what works with stigma and what does not, I introduce the Dodo Bird. And so hence from the title, the Dodo Bird is actually from Alice in Wonderland. And in Alice in Wonderland, a Dodo Bird hosted a race and said everybody is one and all must have prizes, which social scientists often cite as a big problem in research, because if in research everything works, you don't know what to do. And on top of that, sometimes when everything seems to work, actually some things are not as effective as you'd like to think. So the Dodo Bird for me is this cute character that reminds us to be very critical about things. For example, the original meta-analytic research in psychotherapy suggested that Sigmund Freud and putting people on the couch works about as well as Aaron Beck and doing cognitive therapy. We know in retrospect that's not true, but the dilemma with that is the rest of us are left not knowing what to do. And even more important, we don't know what to teach our students, we don't know where to put our funds, we don't know what people with lived experience should seek out. On top of that, we actually know that some approaches may have unintended consequences. So we now know that putting a lot of people on the couch not only probably is ineffective, but can make things worse. And so similarly, we become very interested in what seem to be good ideas for changing stigma and actually can be kind of ineffective. I think it's important to put in perspective that stigma issues. Now, many of you are people with lived experience, many of you are advocates, and so this will seem kind of obvious, but people who fortunately have a medical background or people from academia think stigma is this kind of research topic, or it can be understood from health. And in fact, stigma is an issue of social justice or lack thereof. My culture has some wonderful examples of dealing with social justice. This is Martin Luther King Jr. walking over several African Americans and white folks in Selma, Alabama, trying to deal with racism, or what we've been trying to deal with in the United States is gay rights, which in the last 30 or 40 years has taken a big leap, or even more. I think maybe I'm just going to drive it directly. Even more is the idea of disability rights. In the United States, disability rights originally took form in the case of people with ambulatory problems. The guy in the lower right with the cowboy hat is Justin Dart. He's frequently looked at as the Martin Luther King of disability rights in the United States. He was the force behind the Americans with Disabilities Act. But that said, sometimes people try to change stigma in ways that don't work very well. One example in our history is before Bill Clinton became president, in the United States military, there was an active effort to hunt out gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and push them out of the military. Bill Clinton thought a good answer to that would be don't ask, don't tell, which perhaps at the time was a reasonable answer. What it essentially said is, look, if you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, you stay in the closet, we won't come after you. The problem with that, we know, is, of course, closetedness, which is an issue I'll come back to again. Being in the closet's a horrible place to be. It perpetuates public stigma. Shame on you, don't show yourself to me. It perpetuates self-stigma. And so in many ways, this don't ask, don't tell didn't work very well. In case you don't know it, under the Obama administration, it was repealed. Or another example, again, of unintended consequences, something close to me, is when Jorge Bergoglio became Pope Francis I. I was excited because he's the first Jesuit pope, and I went to a Jesuit university. He named himself after St. Francis of Assisi because his goal was to reorient, rededicate Catholics to the idea of working with the poor and the weak. But in his inaugural mass, he said what we needed to do is focus on the least important, somehow suggesting that if you have a low income, or you're weak, or you have a mental illness, or you're in a wheelchair, you're less important than other people. And what that does is that accentuates what are old notions of how you deal with stigma and injustice, the idea of people in power bestow upon the little guy the opportunities we have, rather than empowering people so they can take advantage of it for themselves. And actually, a lesson I learned from Peter Byrne many years ago is what we're trying to do is we're not asking for pity. We're not asking for people with mental illness to have a handout. What we're asking for is parity. We're looking for the same opportunities that everybody else has. And so for me, one of the take-home messages in terms of dealing with stigma is that stigma issues should be driven by people with lived experience. In the United States, I'm a huge booster, big supporter of African American rights, but my role in that is largely limited to the backseat. I mean, if blacks are going to have any power in the United States, they obviously need to lead the charge, as do women, as do gays. And so similarly, the message here is that people with mental illness need to be leading the charge. And by the way, who are people with mental illness? I don't think there's a litmus test, and I'm intrigued in having to say this, because some people say, you're not mentally ill enough to have mental illness. I mean, for me, everybody has mental health challenges. Some people have mental health challenges which mark them. Not mark them in terms of a brand, but which affect their life. And those are people who identify with having a mental illness, a mental health challenge. And they're the people who probably have lived experience and feel compelled to come out. And so let me briefly share with you where I fall in this. I am a psychologist. I've written the textbook on psychiatric rehabilitation. Actually, the second edition is out. Makes for great stocking stuffers. So if you're looking for something for Christmas this year, I'm also editor of the American Journal of Psychiatric Rehabilitation, so I am a provider and I am a researcher. But I think what really brings me to this is I am a person with lived experience. So I've been, for the last 30 years, struggling with diagnoses alternately of major depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, panic disorder. I've been on meds for years. I know what it means to hide the side effects of meds. I know what it means to meet yet again a new psych resident and have to go through my symptoms because I'm in an emergency situation, or to have my wife explain to my kids that I'm in the hospital. And so stigma is not an abstraction for me. Stigma is a lived experience. The other part of my life is I am a researcher. We're very proud to say the American Psychological Association now supports, publishes a journal called Stigma and Health. Actually, Lee Nifton and Peter Byrne and Nicholas are all on the editorial board of the journal. But I think we briefly need to figure out what is stigma to make sure we're on the same playing field. And so Sam Keen's a sociologist who wrote a book called Faces of the Enemy, looked at through history how groups in power, frequently white men, have disrespected and alienated other groups using the media. In American history, probably one of the worst examples is what the white majority did to African Americans. Scientists say Negroes still an ape stage. I put this in here first to remind you the stigma of mental health challenges in the same category as racism and sexism and ageism. And secondly, to remind you at the heart that this is not an abstraction, this is grossly unjust and inappropriate. And third is this comes from an 1890s American textbook, and American medical textbook. So what we learn is science sometimes grossly perpetuates stigma. Something to keep in mind with some of the mistakes we've made with trying to deal with the stigma of mental illness. This is from Nazi-occupied World War II Denmark. Another way we disrespect the group is showing, in this case, Jews as rats. One half of the population is done in the other half, so the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. A lot of this stuff has gone away in my lifetime. We would have seen the woman thing, for example, in my lifetime. Not so much anymore. Clearly not the case for mental illness. I mean, you see it in movies. The most popular cinematic maniac since Darth Vader, Nightmare on Elm Street, or this is Jason from Friday the 13th. You see it in newspapers, freed mental patient kills mom, or get the violent crazies off of the streets. You see in advertising, this offer could get you committed, Crazy Eddie's Record Asylum. To offer these deals, we have to be committed, maniac out of control. Or this is actually a billboard outside Washington, D.C., Lobster Lunacy. You know, sometimes people say, aren't we just being a little politically correct? I mean, come on, shouldn't you lighten up? Are these really a problem? Of course, the chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for. Some of you may know my wife is a public defender. She defends murderers, and she said she'd know how to kill me if I laughed about this in public. So these are kind of inappropriate images that we no longer accept, as should be this. If you can't make it out, it's a straitjacket filled with nuts, which won the Clio Award, which is the equivalent of the Academy Award in the United States for advertising. This is Gary Larson, who's a very popular artist, a cartoonist. Two things wrong with this. One, obviously, is the message on the pad, making fun of the gentleman on the couch. The other one is that this is a psychiatrist doing it. So if a psychiatrist can laugh at people with mental illness, I guess it's okay for anybody to. Sir, these gentlemen from the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission are here to explain new rules of mental illness in the workplace. So I now understand the EU has equivalent to what we would call the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the federal legislation that protects people from being discriminated against. George Bush, the first George Bush, signed it in 1990. It was in place 5 years before anybody ever bothered applying it to psychiatric disabilities. This is what came out as a result of it. S is for Stanley. Stanley's a crazy murderer who likes to murder little boys and girls early Sunday morning. Are you afraid of Stanley? This comes from A to Z dictionary by Shel Silverstein, who's a very prominent, very well-known children's author in the United States. Is it any better? I mean, some of these are old. Some of these come out of a book by Otto Wall called Media Madness. There's two more recent examples. This is from downstate Ohio. To make sense of it, pretend the woman's not there. So you're looking in the front window of a printing company. You see an alcohol bottle kicked over, a chair down, 2 legs hanging down, and a note saying, contemplating suicide? Get your notes printed here. If that's not bad enough, she's the owner of the company, and when they try to explain it to her, she didn't understand the big deal. Or this, Trenton State Hospitals, downstate New Jersey. If you know A Beautiful Mind with John Nash, this is where he would go when he would relapse. Had a fire. The next day, local headlines said roasted nuts. So the disrespectful images of mental illness and mental health challenges are still quite broad and obvious.